All right, week 6, our final week of the class. Quick overview of some materials, some background information for you. So we'll be looking at war accounts by civilians. Here are the books and the optional books that we'll be pulling from. Starting with Barefoot Gun. If you've never read this book, I would highly recommend it. I've used this with middle school, high school. It's a great book, graphic novel. Much like Mizuki's book here, it was written by someone who actually experienced the events. In this case, our author was a young man when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. So the book kind of chronicles his life prior to the atomic bomb and then ends with some fairly graphic images of the atomic bomb. Books 2 through 10 cover his life after the bomb. In fact, I believe book 2 is called like The Next Day or The Day After. Great book, but like Mizuki's book, there will be some slight changes. It might be 90% fact, but there's still some slight changes. For example, the author's name was not Gen. Nakazawa does change a few minor details when he writes his book, when he writes about his life. For example, he writes that he helped deliver his baby sister when in fact he wasn't there when his baby sister was born. Whether or not those minor changes change it from fiction to nonfiction, that's up for debate, I guess. The book itself, like I said, I would highly recommend it. Your section here, it's going to be focused on what it was like to be, especially this young man, and what it was like for his father, who was not pro-war. He was speaking out against the war in Japan. So you'll be looking at that. All right, voices. Voices from Hiroshima Nagasaki. What this is a collection of all sorts of different writings by people who survived the atomic bombs. We've got different types of poems. We got different types of fiction, nonfiction, all sorts of things. So you'll be looking at some short accounts from that and a few poems. If you've taken some of my classes before, you know I'm a big fan of this book. I've used some poems from it before. So I tried to pull a different selection of poems, different selection from the book, just in case you're familiar with the poems already. I do recommend this book. Yes, you could get survivor poetry online for free, but this is a nice handy book to grab, and it's nice to have on the bookshelf. All right, so your selection, obviously these are people who survived the bombing. So you'll look at a bunch of different things, including some pictures with some short writings underneath. Take what you can carry. This is a book written, one of our few books written not by someone of Asian descent. What is kind of interesting about this book, it follows two stories. One of them is a modern day story, and that one's in this blue coloring, and it's someone who's going down the path of being a juvenile delinquent, especially towards a particular store that's run by someone who was a Japanese American in one of the forced relocation camps during World War II. That man's story is in a very different color, in brown. The Japanese American story has no words in it, whereas the modern day delinquent story does have words. So there is definitely a bunch of things to look at with this book. This whole idea of why are there no words? They don't get to speak. They don't have a voice. What does that mean? You've got the two parallel stories going on. So there's a lot going on there. But what we're going to be looking at specifically, not so much the being sent to the camps or things like that. We're going to look at what it was like to be in the camps, mostly. All right. Gaijin, American Prisoner of War. This is actually a book published by Disney. And the look of it is very much like a little kid's picture book. But the things that happen in the book, the ideas it deals with the racism and uh, anti-Japanese sentiment and all this other stuff. Definitely not what you would expect with a little kid picture book, so it's deceptive in its look. This particular book is based on actual family accounts, while the author is, a white guy. That's part of the reason why it's in the optional reading selection. He wrote this based on accounts of a family member of his, and an aunt who married a Japanese citizen. Children were obviously then half Japanese, half American, and then what they dealt with as far as racism during this time period. So it's interesting from that point of view. The selections we're going to be looking at are primarily focused on what kind of racism and bullying, things like that, existed inside the internment camps or the relocation camps or whatever you want to call them. You might be familiar with the author, Linda Sue Park. She's written a few pretty famous books. She is of Korean descent, likes to set a few of her stories in Korea, especially in the past. So this particular book, we've got two protagonists. We've got the main character who's a female, and then another main character who's her older brother. Both of them are Koreans living in Korea during the Japanese occupation of Korea. You get a look at what it was like to be Korean, the racism towards Koreans in Korea, talking about, how families are treated and what someone will do to go, the lengths they'll go to try and get some peace or respect for their family and things like that. So you'll be looking at that. You've got a few different selections to give you an idea of what it was like. One thing that the author does go into just real briefly and mentions more in the postscript at the end of the book. She talks about comfort women. So that is the only part of the book that might make you want to maybe shy away from it in middle school. She doesn't go into details or anything like that, but that could be an awkward conversation if the kid asks you what's a comfort woman. So just throwing that out there. If you're someone who wants to avoid conversations like that, don't expect to use the whole book. But other than that, it is definitely a book that could be used in the classroom. So if you want to avoid that conversation, if you use the book, don't read the postscript at the end. So Korea during World War II, it's controlled by the Japanese. Resources are being taken out of Korea. The food sources that Koreans were used to start to disappear as the war goes on. Materials that were available start to disappear. Koreans have to change their names to Japanese-style names. They have to go to school that's run by Japanese people. The classes might still be taught by Korean teachers, but the person in charge of the school is Japanese. And so it starts to completely change Korea, especially in this time. You've got young kids who are out digging airfields or defenses or whatever as part of the expectation. You've got block leaders pulling out people for kind of inspections and all sorts of things going on. So it's interesting from that standpoint as well, what it's like to be a young, I don't want to say a young child necessarily. I mean, she was old enough where she might have been sent off as a comfort woman, our fictional character, had she not been able to speak Japanese so well. Her younger brother does enlist in the military to be a kamikaze pilot in the story. It is fiction, but the author did do a lot of research. So that's your quick little preview of the materials. Any questions, as always, send them. I look forward to hearing your final comments on the class and seeing your final posts. All right.